So I'm really excited to talk to you about ecology. We're going to start off with an introduction to ecology. So this chapter goes through a lot of basic information about earth science and introduces you to the biomes of the earth. So ecology, by definition, is a study of how organisms interact with their environment, both biotic and abiotic elements of their environment. And there are lots of different scales at which ecologists ask questions. So first of all, you can think about kind of an organismal scale, which is the study called ought ecology, which is the focus of how do individuals and or species interact with their environments. And then there's a field called behavioral ecology, which is a study of how individuals and populations behave. Like, what do they do? How do they act? Then moving out, you have groups of individuals of the same species, which we call populations, and how do they interact with each other? That's population ecology. And then moving out even further, we have what's called community ecology, which is focused on interactions among different species and an exploration of biodiversity. Then we have, at an even larger scale, ecosystem ecology, which the focus is on nutrients and energy fluxes between different habitat types. And finally, global ecology, which is the ecology at the scale of the entire globe. So studies of continents and atmospheric circulation and things like climate change. So this table from the book, I think, does a nice job of focusing in on these various scales and using salmon as an example, which is a great Pacific Northwest example, and moving from the organismal level up through the global level. And so it asks a research question, and then it focuses on something that an ecologist might study. So I would like you to pause the video briefly, and I want you to think about a species that you're interested in. So maybe not salmon, something that you're really passionate about, and try to think about what you might see at various scales if you're an ecologist studying that organism. And I want you to write out a research question that you might ask about your organism at each scale. And I'd encourage you to actually pause the video and do this because it will prepare you for the quiz. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to write out your research questions, and you might use those to study from and keep them handy when you get to the quiz. So I want to focus on the fact that ecology is super interdisciplinary. So if you were to take a full-blown ecology course at the college level, it would typically be a 300 or 400 level course. And the reason is that it builds on so many different disciplines. So it builds definitely on an understanding of general biology, but also on chemistry, on mathematics, on physiology, on physics, atmospheric science, oceanography, zoology, evolutionary biology, meteorology, climate science, natural history, fire, geospatial science, remote sensing. All of these things are important to the study of ecology, and that's what makes it such a fun discipline, but it also makes it really hard. It's really hard to know something about all of these disciplines, and most of us don't. Most of us kind of specialize in one or a few areas. It's really difficult to know everything about all of the aspects of ecology. There are lots of more specific disciplines of ecology. So things like agroecology, chemical ecology, desert ecology, ecotoxicology, macroecology, paleoecology, systems ecology, theoretical ecology, urban ecology. There's lots of different disciplines and things that you might specialize in as an ecologist. Forensic ecology. There's economic ecology. There's all kinds of things out there that you can focus on. So lots of possibilities for careers and graduate work. And then I want to just mention briefly, at least, the fact that everything that we understand about ecology is built on thousands, millions of years of traditional ecological knowledge. And And so we need to give credit to the people that came before us in all parts of the world. So there are indigenous peoples on every continent, I guess, except Antarctica. Um, and those indigenous peoples hold a huge amount of knowledge about how natural systems work, how organisms interact with their environments, and it's really important that we not take this knowledge from them, but that we that we understand where it comes from, and that we work with indigenous communities to help caretake the ecosystems that they rely on. So there's a lot of really interesting reading around traditional ecological knowledge. These are just some of the books that I've seen or been able to read myself. And so I just encourage you to dig into this if it's something that you're interested in. So moving on, the book is this first chapter really just kind of introduces you to a lot of different topics. So the first is conservation biology. What is conservation biology? It's the effort to study, preserve, and restore threatened populations, communities, and ecosystems. So the species that you see here, the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, the Oregon spotted frog, western pond turtle, and golden paintbrush, they are all endangered either at the federal level or the state level, and they are all cared for by incarcerated Evergreen students through what's called the Sustainability in Prisons Project, which is a partnership between Evergreen and the Washington State Department of Corrections. So it's a really neat program. And it provides incarcerated individuals with opportunities to care for endangered species, to learn about restoration and biology and entomology and horticulture. And it gives people some really meaningful work to do while they're spending their time behind bars. And it's also a really amazing opportunity for Evergreen students, staff, and faculty to interact with really interesting people that find themselves in unfortunate circumstances for whatever reason. So if you want to learn more, there's a video linked here at the bottom that talks about the work through their own voices. So moving on to biogeography, it's really neat when we study patterns of organisms across the landscape. So it's the study of how organisms are distributed geographically. And biogeography is influenced by interactions that organisms have with their abiotic and biotic environments at each location. And here you can see a picture showing one of the continental configurations that existed in previous times, and how we can see fossil remains crossing over these continental boundaries because they used to be combined. So, for example, we only see the fossil remains of this little guy here in these orange areas, but they match up between South America and Africa. And so do these green areas and blue areas. And then these green and brown areas match up across India and down into Antarctica and over into Australia. So this provides some really great evidence for how the continents shifted over time. And it was only in the 1960s that we really had enough evidence for what's called plate tectonics, which is the theory behind how the continents move and the different configurations that they've had through geologic time. So there are many abiotic factors that influence where organisms live. Do any species live everywhere on Earth? No, not really. There's no species that lives everywhere on Earth. Each species has its own range, its own distribution, and a suite of conditions that it can tolerate, which is called its niche. So here you can see a niche for an Arctic microbe, which is much colder than a hot springs microbe, which you'd only find in a very narrow hot range. And these two do not overlap. You would not find hot springs microbes in the Arctic or Arctic microbes in hot springs because their niches do not overlap. So there are also biotic factors that influence where species live. And these biotic factors would be other living organisms. So these would be factors like competition, parasitism, mutualism, and other interactions that can affect how species are distributed. So for example, on the African continent, the tsetse fly is kind of a pest for cattle, and they damage cattle, and so they can limit the distribution of cattle. which are actually native to Australia. So you can see in red places where the tsetse fly is distributed, and in blue, the places where the cattle are distributed. And you see that there's only a few places right along the edges where where both are found, and those are in purple. And so you can see the flies and the cattle are kind of um, keeping each other out of different parts of habitats that might otherwise be acceptable.